When we began organizing this conference a year ago, we felt very strongly that it was important, as we work on a day-to-day basis on the front line with the families or individuals that come to this country, either as refugee claimants or as resettled refugees, government assisted or privately sponsored, that it was important to provide a bigger context, to understand how our work on the front line is impacted by some of the global discussions underway in various parts of the world. And when I said that I wanted to bring someone from Australia, Paris Aristotle's name immediately came up. I sent him a note and I said, you know, would you be interested in doing this gig for us? Immediately he said, absolutely. And so on Wednesday this week, on World Refugee Day, you know, as he described it to me, he left at 10:30 in the morning and arrived at 7:30 in the morning. He was on the walking tour at noon. He went to the library for the World Refugee Day, and he's still standing. He's still awake. Paris Aristotle, among many distinguished things, including his name, he is the director and founder of the Victorian Foundation for Survivors of Torture. For more than 20 years, he's held senior positions on government advisory bodies in refugee resettlement and humanitarian fields. He's currently the chair of the Minster for Immigration and Citizenship Council on Asylum Seekers and Detention. He's also a member of the federal government's Refugee Resettlement Advisory Council, the Residence Determination Reference Group, and the Onshore Protection Consultative Group. He has extensive experience in the area of refugee resettlement and the provision of services to survivors of torture and trauma. In 2002, in recognition of his distinct, outstanding work, Paris was made a member of the Order of Australia, recognizing his long-standing work with refugees and asylum seekers. So it gives me absolute great pleasure to welcome him from down under here this morning to share with us some insights on what's happening down under.
Thanks very much, Chris. And it is wonderful to be here. I'm not quite sure if I'm over my jet-lagged state yet. I did think I was yesterday. I went to the gym, as I said to Deborah, in search of the Adonis buried deep within. Why are you laughing? And then I thought I was right, and at about midnight I was pretty well wired and didn't think I was ever going to get to sleep. But I made up for it this morning by pouring coffee all down the front of my shirt, which is why I got my jacket buttoned up. Look, it's. Can I also just add my congratulations to the organisers of this? Yesterday was a fantastic day. The two keynote addresses were great. A bit annoying, really, because you have to live up to that. Judith, you're up next. But they were fantastic, and the workshops and the enthusiasm and the interest in them was great as well. So congratulations to everyone that's put the effort in to make this possible. Look, one of the things I want to say is that I hope you don't take the title literally, because or have any unrealistic expectations that I can give you a definitive picture of what's going to happen in Australia. It's a very fluid environment for us at the moment. And the future directions with regards to the treatment of refugees and asylum seekers are very uncertain, particularly with regards to asylum seekers. You'd have to be pretty brave or pretty foolhardy, or both, which I often do qualify for, to try to make some definitive claims with a great deal of confidence. Probably a more apt title for the talk would be, after that great Clint Eastwood spaghetti western, The Good, the Bad and the Ugly, because currently Australian policy is a mixture of all three. And from what it sounds like, Canada's is heading in a similar direction. But I want to say that Australia is not alone in terms of some of the challenges it confronts and the way in which it deals with asylum seekers. The truth is, if you look at any country around the world, what you get, as Jim was saying yesterday, are different versions of bad, which is why the point he was making about a rethink of how we go about doing things, not a rethink of the convention, but a rethink of how we go about doing things, is well and truly overdue. And until we get a handle on that, we're going to continue to struggle with things. But I hope the presentation today gives you some idea of what we're doing, some of the good things that we do that you might want to learn from, and also some of the things you may not want to see copied. But unfortunately, there's a lot of recent reports of other countries, Canada, New Zealand and others, talking about doing what Australia does. I don't hear them talking about, in New Zealand's case, for example, doing what Australia does in terms of resettlement, but more to do with asylum seekers. One of the great things about Australia and Canada is that we share a fair bit in common in terms of our histories. We're both countries of migration, which makes us multicultural and our diversity very strong. I think our diversity in both situations nourishes us, it sustains us, and it helps to shape our place in the world. What we do and how we model managing our diverse societies and how they can flourish socially, economically and culturally models for other countries around the world how they can do that better as well. I think our response to resettled refugees is one example of how we do this well. Equally, however, we can model how not to manage aspects well. In my view, our treatment of asylum seekers is one of the critical areas where that is definitely true. The uprooting and displacement of millions of people throughout the world and their search for asylum is one of the most controversial human rights issues of our time. While there are many complex reasons for this, a few of them that I'd like to talk about are the unending parlous state of existence that millions of refugees endure, the international community's continued failure to resolve protracted crises or to provide refugees with any real or anything that resembles a timely resolution, the nexus between migration and protection issues, and this is probably one of the most critical ones for me, and it answers, there was a very good question asked yesterday morning of Jim about why this is not of great interest to states, or it doesn't have the same level of importance in states' minds at the moment. And in my view, the answer to that question, can everyone remember that one that was asked? In my view, the principal answer to that question is that in Western democracies, political success has come from linking people seeking asylum to matters of security, border protection and sovereignty, whether they're related or not. It's a great wedge issue politically, and it's one that's been manipulated all over the world, not just Australia, not just in Canada. In France, Le Pen has done extremely well in local government elections based on this. In Denmark, the balance of power was swung on this issue, the same as in Norway. In the UK, the tabloids cover this every single day. That political dimension and political capital is gold to governments and oppositions, is in my view the thing that is generating the greatest level of distortion in this area of work and focus. Now, there's two pernicious aspects of Australian policy that currently exist, that existed previously, and if there's going to be a change of government, will be reintroduced. Some that have been done away with now will be reintroduced. They are non-reviewable mandatory detention and the previous temporary protection visa regime. Now, I understand temporary protection is part of the agenda in Canada at present, is that correct? Yeah. It's just been amended. Okay. Anyway, I'll just talk to you a little bit about that. Such policies are framed through the artificial construction of concepts such as good and bad refugees. And they do that in order to justify what former UN Secretary-General Kofi Annan described as the desire of wealthy countries to keep the problems of poorer nations at arm's length. Resettlement is a vital protection tool that should be significantly increased. But in reality, there is not so much a queue as a tragic, desperate, gut-wrenching heap from under which some people are occasionally dragged. Jim covered this eloquently yesterday, but the notion that there is a clear, orderly queue is actually not true. As for the bad refugees, they represent those who cannot bear the weight any longer and who seek other means of finding the security that they crave. This false dichotomy shifts the ground in refugee protection by emphasising a refugee's worthiness in terms of the mode of entry into a country, as opposed to the nature and effect of the refugee experience itself. While this is an extremely complex issue, and it is an extremely complex issue, in part because of that point that I made about the nexus between migration and protection, it still is a sad indictment on the international community's world's efforts in this field. I'm going to return to these issues a bit later in more detail, if I can just get the technology right. This slide shows the number of visas granted over the last 11 years in what the Australian government refers to as the humanitarian program. The people who receive humanitarian visas are overwhelmingly people who've been recognised as refugees under the Refugee Convention, or people who need protection from circumstances similar to those experienced by refugees, and the families of refugees and others granted protection. Offshore refers to people who were granted visas to come to Australia while they are living in other countries or in refugee camps. Onshore refers to people who are granted visas after arriving in Australian territory. They begin the process as asylum seekers. I'll talk a bit more detail about these groups shortly, but before doing so, I want to draw your attention to another feature on this slide about the humanitarian program, and that is the overall number of visas has been reasonably stable at around 13 to 14,000. The stability is not an accident, and it is perhaps something that you may need to contemplate avoiding as potentially appealing to your own government. It reflects a policy introduced in 1996 and 97 that put a numerical cap on the program by linking the number of onshore visas and offshore visas. The more onshore visas granted, the fewer offshore would be granted, and vice versa. Australia is apparently the only country in the world with a formal numerical link between offshore and onshore refugee programs. It's a controversial policy that I'll say a little bit more about as well. Now, this is just about the offshore grants, so it's not including onshore. This slide shows visas under the humanitarian program that were granted to people who were living outside of Australia over recent years, with a projection in the current year ending in mid-2012. The reason why there's a decline is that the onshore quota numbers are increasing. There are two main subgroups that are indicated. The first is titled refugee, which comprises mainly of refugees designated by UNHCR and referred to Australia for resettlement. The other is called the Special Humanitarian Program, with the acronym SHP. The UNHCR referred, you'll note that for a number of years Australia has resettled around 6,000 people a year who were referred by UNHCR. It has consistently been the second or third largest. Deborah and Australian officials are always having a tit for tat about this at meetings in Geneva. It has consistently been the second or third largest resettlement program in the world. The USA is the largest, and Canada has been of a similar scale. There's strong support for resettlement of this size, or even larger, across the political spectrum. But there is always a caveat put on it, which is if they can slow the number of boat arrivals, they'll increase the number of resettlement places. Now, I don't know whether they'll actually do that if they manage to slow the number of boat arrivals or not, but that's the reason. In fact, both the government and the opposition have that stated in current policy. These are realities that, this notion of good and bad refugees are realities that cause real tensions across refugee communities and people working in the field, because these 2 points are both indisputable. And given the structure of domestic programs and fortressing policies, such people are comparatively disadvantaged at some levels. So people are stuck in camp. This issue cannot be ignored. We can't ignore the fact that some people spend generations, as you saw in the DVD last night, the film last night. They spend generations in refugee camps, 10, 20, 30 years living in refugee camps. They often don't have the resources available to them to pay people smugglers in order to come. Now, there's no point in disputing that. In our sector, sometimes you get debates, the sector argues with the government about the toss about that. It's a reality, and we have to deal with it and confront it. Slide number 3. These are the major regions from which Australia takes UNHCR referred refugees. For various reasons, there have been changes in the regional composition over the years. The key reason for the increase in the proportion from Asia is the government's desire to secure the cooperation of regional governments to stop the flow of asylum seekers passing through their countries and heading for Australia. Both the government and the opposition have spoken, as I said earlier, about increasing our resettlement program generally, but only if they can get that aspect under control. The other critical consideration is financial. The Australian government calculates that each resettled refugee costs the taxpayer many thousands of dollars in welfare and expenditure. One of the costings last year, when they costed an increase of 1,000 places, they put the total cost of that at $250 million per 1,000 places over 4 years. The calculation is contentious, but while the Australian government, and I imagine the Canadian government as well, is fixated on spending at the moment due to the global financial crisis, it's difficult to see how a significant increase is going to be forthcoming. What's been little spoken about is whether the size of the resettled component will be protected, even if the significant increase in number of onshore cases continues to rise. So we don't know, for example, so far, if I can come to the next slide. So far over the years, the number of visas granted each year onshore have eaten into that special humanitarian component of our program. That special humanitarian component is the one often where family reunion takes place as well. So what we're experiencing at the moment is that people from Sudan, Burmese, Iraqis out of Syria and so forth are likely not to be able to be reunited with family members ever, because that quota, the special humanitarian portion of our program, is being taken up by onshore claimants as a result of the government linking the two programs. Sorry. This is quite important for us to come to grips with. You can see the trend here that the onshore component is growing, is taking up larger and larger portions. Once it goes through the 7,500 special humanitarian program places, my view is that the government will begin sacrificing UNHCR referred places for those places as well, because cabinets don't sit around the table necessarily and contemplate what the numbers are, they don't contemplate what the actual aspects of the convention are that they need to think about. They think in terms of dollars and numbers, and they've made a decision that this is generally the number that we can accept, and that's how, and they're going to cap it at all costs. Obviously, we're going to resist that and make a strong case, try to make a strong case for that not happening, but I can't see that actually being successful at this point in time. As indicated on the slide, the number of SHP visas granted has been greatly reduced in recent years. In the current year, there's only going to be about 750 places for those family reunion spots. I suspect, with current trends, that's probably not even going to be that many. At the moment in Australia, we're getting around about between 800 and 1,300 new arrivals every month by boat. They have very high approval rates, sometimes up within 90%. And so the expectation is that as that increases, the number of places in our quota for offshore refugees is going to reduce. I mentioned the Special Humanitarian Program is essentially a vehicle for family reunification. It's not dissimilar to your private sponsorship program. Someone has to be nominated and sponsored by people in the community or a community group, and they have to contribute to the costs of people coming. But private groups such as community and faith groups are also able to be proposers in that program. It doesn't just have to be family members. Several months ago, the government announced that it was interested in the possibility of having a private scheme with a couple of aims, and this is, I think, modelled on the Canadian scheme, to increase community engagement with the humanitarian program and to potentially increase the size of the program at relatively less expense to government that would be involved in increasing the intake under existing components. The Australian government checks applicants for visas closely to try to ensure that they do not want them to come in order to claim asylum. We have lots of people who seek asylum, visitors who are seeking asylum, not in the same scale as Canada, but for Australia it's considered to be quite a lot. One of the reasons we don't have as many as countries like Canada and the US is we have incredibly rigorous migration systems overseas as well. We have people at borders, at airports, we have systems in place where people won't even be granted a visitor's visa if they fit a particular profile from a particular country in a particular region. We spend millions and millions of dollars each year on these sort of visa enforcement and border protection type measures, which if we weren't doing, the numbers in Australia would be substantially higher. Our point about that is that, well, if we're doing all of that anyway, and it is obviously having the impact of reducing the numbers of people who are claiming, why are we becoming so fixated about linking the two programs and so forth? Because the numbers aren't numerically that high. The issue of irregular maritime arrivals, and I'm not sure what sort of language you use. One of the things that I find bizarre about this work is the language that people come up with to describe things. But the irregular maritime arrivals are people who arrive by boat in Australia. So we have non-irregular maritime arrivals and we have irregular maritime arrivals. The non-irregulars are the ones, as I said earlier, apply for a visa to come to Australia, and then those who come by boat are treated very differently. There's a different area of law developed for people who come by boat. They have different entitlements. We have islands that are excised from the migration zone, so that if someone arrives by boat in Australia, they end up, and they are detected in part of the excised territory. They're processed in a different way to people who arrived with a visa. These are very specific strategies designed deliberately to try and tackle what we consider to be people smuggling. So there's a real differentiation in how they're treated. Historically, temporary protection visas, for example, were only ever applied to people who arrived by boat in Australia. Not asylum seekers that arrived by air, only those that arrived by boat. There are a whole lot of disincentives that were generated, particularly towards that group. Just not sure whether I've got the right slide. Oh, sorry, this slide actually shows you the trend in arrivals in that pattern that I was talking about. So you can see that the number of SHPs, the refugee line is flatlined, but the green line, which is the onshore, is going up dramatically. The hostility, the anxiety and hostility that irregular maritime arrivals evoke is quite profound. To outside observers, the domestic refugee advocates, and to domestic refugee advocates, the strength of the antagonism can be perplexing, given the relatively small scale of arrivals. Mr. Guterres characterised it very diplomatically during his visit as follows: compared to the refugee problems in other regions of the world, it is my belief that this debate has been very politicised and is out of proportion in relation to the real dimension of the issues, as the numbers of people coming to Australia are small by global standards. The regional UNHCR representative Rick Toll has been more outspoken, describing the debate about asylum seekers as toxic and lamenting the loss of public support for the institution of asylum. Some of the language is indeed vitriolic. A couple of weeks ago, for example, a prominent radio broadcaster, this is a radio broadcaster on mainstream radio, told his listeners, and I quote, "Bugger the boat people, I say. As far as I'm concerned, I hope they bloody drown out there on their way over here." Now, this stuff happens all the time. I don't know about Canada, but we have shock jocks in Australia that are capable of saying the most extraordinary things and getting away with it. But they have very large audiences, and this sort of stuff is not uncommon. Irregular maritime arrivals are commonly vilified as so-called queue jumpers, who unfairly take scarce humanitarian places from people who have waited patiently for years in refugee camps. There is an element of truth in the accusation in that each onshore arrival granted a visa, as I said earlier, does take the place of a potential offshore person. But what's not acknowledged is that the displacement is a direct result of our government's policy to link the two programs. Over the last 2 decades, irregular maritime arrivals have been subject to a number of harsh policies. And I spoke of them earlier. Temporary protection visas. In 1999, the government introduced a policy that granted temporary rather than permanent visas to people who were irregular maritime arrivals and were found to be refugees. They were designed, as I said earlier, to deter that group of people through 2 aspects. First, that they were temporary, 3 to 5 years, could be extended if the person could demonstrate continued need for protection at the end of that period. Second, visa holders were not permitted to be reunited with immediate family members still living overseas. They weren't allowed to travel overseas, and they weren't allowed to apply for citizenship. The policy failed to stop any boats. When people were denied the possibility of family reunion, the impact wasn't to stop boats, it was that whole family groups were getting on boats. And so the decision that people made was that, okay, I won't come first and then sponsor my family, we'll put the whole family on boats. Now in Australia in recent years, or in this context in recent years, we've had a number of boats go down. Just 2 days ago, a boat carrying, well initially they thought it was Sri Lankan asylum seekers, but now they're saying it was Tamil 200 capsized in the ocean. They've managed to rescue about 90, but they think the rest have perished. A little while before that, a boat carrying 230 asylum seekers sunk on its way out of Indonesia, all of them dying. This happens all of the time. I visit detention centres and I'm talking to people in those centres, and I often have people coming up to me and saying, my cousin or my brother or my father or whatever was on a boat 3 or 4 months ago. I haven't heard from him since. There are boats going down all of the time. It's a terrible, terrible set of circumstances that we're trying to confront here, and it throws up all sorts of challenges, moral and ethical challenges for me, which I'll come to in a minute. Temporary protection visas, one of the problems with temporary protection visas is that they lay the blame for the outcomes of war and human displacement at the feet of the victims who've been displaced. It reflects a cruel contradiction by locating fault with an innocent person fleeing persecution. Just as is the case with detention, the temporary protection regime places fences around a person's life, rendering them unable to attain the emotional and psychological security they need in order to settle and to re-establish themselves. Most disturbingly, though, are the psychological ramifications of the temporary protection visa system that act actually to preserve the persecutory regime's goals, and that's particularly bad in the case of torture and trauma survivors. While I'm sure it was an unintentional thing, the personal effect of TP visa on individuals and families is to maintain the isolation, shame and humiliation that persecutors hoped would haunt them forever, no matter where they sought sanctuary. This is how they ultimately seek, persecutors that is, lasting influence over the lives of the people they've brutalised, how they seek to taint them in order to create a sense that their power over them is omnipotent. Our response to people such as this can either allow such feelings and trauma to become entrenched, or can serve as a repudiation of the torturer's goals and allow them to recover. TPVs facilitate the former aspect occurring and diminish our ability to achieve the latter. As a consequence, the justification and structure of temporary protection visas can't merely be contextualised in the legitimate desire of governments to protect the national interest by combating the phenomenon of people smuggling. It must also be considered in the context of the values and standard against which we want to live and be judged, and how that also relates to protecting the national interest. The contention here is that policies steeped in a negative value base, particularly policies that cause harm to innocent people, do not serve either the national or the international interest. The temporary protection visa policy was ended after a change of government in 2007, but our opposition have said that they'll reintroduce it if they're elected, and the chances are they're going to be re-elected. But not only will they reintroduce it, they're going to toughen it. So they will, if in their policy platform, if you're granted a temporary protection visa, it will be permanent. You'll never be granted a permanent visa. You'll never get citizenship. You won't be able to be reunited with family. That's the current policy of the opposition. The next one was the Pacific solution. The most radical and notorious deterrent policy was the Pacific solution. Under this policy, irregular maritime arrivals were not assessed for refugee protection by Australia, but transferred to other countries, Nauru and Papua New Guinea. Their asylum claims were processed in those countries, and there they remained until they were resettled. In the event, a major majority were resettled in Australia. Understandably, few other countries were willing to contribute to helping Australia to shed what was commonly seen as its responsibility. Like the temporary protection visa policy, this policy was ended following the change of government in 2007. However, in response to the significant increase in arrivals, irregular maritime arrivals, the government in 2010 wanted to reinstate that policy, but not in Nauru. The government's been unable to do so though. They wanted to establish a transfer to, if people arrived by boat, they were going to transfer them back to Malaysia, where they would be processed in Malaysia, but not necessarily for resettlement to Australia. That was their strategy. But the opposition opposed it, not because they opposed offshore processing, but because they wanted it to be Nauru. I have to say though, I'm not entirely sure that the opposition will necessarily be able to implement that policy. It's the High Court in Australia at the moment has taken a very strong stand on these sorts of issues and has set a very high benchmark for effective protection, and whether or not they can achieve that by sending people to Nauru will obviously be challenged in the courts, and we'll have to await the outcome of that. So they may not be able to implement that sort of a policy anyway. They'll be able to do TPVs, but not necessarily the offshore processing arrangements. When the Pacific solution was instituted, the government was unashamedly presented as a solution to the Australian problem, engineered through its bilateral relations. Nauru and Papua New Guinea were simply the sites for the implementation of policy to serve Australia's interests, and were well remunerated for the service. The present government has presented its attempted version, as I said earlier, with regards to Malaysia, but failed to get that implemented. While UNHCR has significant concerns about the proposals that have been mooted, it has also seen a potential opportunity to encourage the states in the region to enhance the effective protection of many refugees and asylum seekers. Now, this is a really difficult issue. One of the things that people would probably appreciate is that for protection to be improved, we need better international and regional arrangements in place, which I think is partly what Jim was relating to yesterday. While we were all incredibly uncomfortable with this notion of returning people to Malaysia, one of the things that UNHCR felt, and some others felt, was that by doing that, it could be the beginning of establishing credible regional arrangements where thousands of refugees in Malaysia or Indonesia or whatever would be able to be better protected or cared for while they were in a process for seeking asylum, instead of them having to pay a smuggler and get on a boat. Now, that's a very laudable objective in my view, and something that we should have serious discussions about. But the problem for us was that there were no clear enough guarantees of protection for people that would be returned because of Malaysia's record in that area previously. The commitments the Malaysian government had given were quite extraordinary in comparison to what they'd been prepared to do before. They gave UNHCR access at a level that UNHCR had never had before as a consequence of this. They treated people differently who had got refugee status designated by UNHCR in Malaysia, beginning to consider to allow them to work, not automatically detaining them, or if they were detained, being prepared to release them. There were all of these things about regional arrangements that Australia was trying to pursue, principally for its purposes, but the challenge for us was, were there opportunities to create better regional and international arrangements as a consequence of that in Australia. And the reason being that Malaysia has over 100,000 refugees living in Malaysia, asylum seekers. Indonesia, I'm not quite sure of the figure, it's not as high as that, but it's very substantial. So in reality, in those countries, there are many more people that needed assistance than the ones that were coming to Australia. It's a dilemma that I don't think we've come to grips with properly yet. The other area that I want to talk about is immigration detention. In the 1990s, Australia introduced a system of so-called mandatory detention. This involves the legal and policy framework under which people without visas can be detained without time limits and without recourse to the courts to determine whether their detention is necessary for the purposes such as protecting the community. The policy has been applied mainly to irregular maritime arrivals. Successive governments have claimed that immigration detention is purely administrative, to deal with the health, security and identity issues and to ensure people are available for processing, that it is not intended to punish asylum seekers or to deter people. The claim that detention has been used purely for rational and reasonable administrative purposes is strongly contested. I think the other technical term is crap, but this has in fact been the principal source through which successive Australian governments have tried to present to the public that they are tough and in control. It has clearly been used as a form of deterrence and for the management of community concerns about there being potentially dangerous or antisocial people among the asylum seekers. The mere act of putting them behind fences and in detention facilities, it presents them and criminalises the perception of them, which is of course grossly unfair. As a consequence, thousands of men, women and children have been and are being detained while their applications for residence in Australia are determined. This has been the principal tool through which the political capital that I was referring to earlier has been built for electoral purposes. It's a great image to tell the public, we've got this under control, we've got them in detention centres and so forth. One of the problems is that the decision-making process sometimes takes years. And the reality is prolonged and indefinite detention has had very damaging consequences, manifested, for example, in mental illness, self-harm and suicide. The reality is that after watching this for some 20 years and being very closely involved in the area for the last 12 years, I can say with confidence that this type of detention fails at almost every level. It neither deters arrivals nor does it improve the management of refugee status determination processes. It neither improves outcomes for individuals nor does it meet international human rights obligations. It is neither efficient nor is it cost effective. I believe in the integrity and worthiness of the Convention and for the need to preserve it in its current form. In doing so, I also have to say that if it's going to be viable, then people who've been found not to be in need of protection should be able to be returned. I think that's an inevitable part of having a refugee convention. If you can't return people, there's no point in having a refugee convention. But the claim that detention helps do that is rubbish. Over the years, over the last 12 years of my involvement, and at some of the most senior levels, I'd suggest that less than 5% of people have ever been returned from a detention centre, either voluntarily or involuntarily. It just doesn't happen. Groupthink takes over, people become extremely distressed, it turns into riots. The ability to move people is difficult. Many people are stateless. If you're from Iran and if you're not prepared to cooperate with your removal, the Iranian government won't allow you back in anyway. If you're a failed Kurd, you can't get back in. If you're Kuwaiti Badoon, you can't. If you're Palestinian, you can't. So there are all of these sorts of issues that meant that people returning out of detention is simply a fallacy. The view that it works at any level is just plain wrong. I think one of the issues is that if I was trying to think of what's a simple yardstick for good social policy, and if you thought that the best yardstick for social policy was that the people it touched were better off as a consequence of being touched by it, in very basic and simple terms, then that reinforces the fact that this is a failure. No one has been better off as a result of mandatory detention. Nobody. Asylum seekers? No. The people who work in the centres, running the centres, they're not better off. Many of them are on workers' compensation claims and so forth. Government officials who have to administer it are often stressed by that experience and are not better off. Advocates, activists, community groups, all of those are not better off, and the taxpayer is not better off. Because of the cost of over $1 billion a year, can you imagine how many schools or hospitals or so forth could be built with that sort of money? So no one is better off in this area of social policy, yet because of that point that I made at the beginning around the political capital that is gained and generated as a consequence of this, it continues to be implemented. Now, if you make this point to anyone and they challenge it by pointing to Australia, just ask them for the evidence. When they say, but it worked in Australia, ask them for that evidence, because it doesn't exist. There is no evidence that anyone can produce for you that tells you this is an effective way of managing anything. None at all. And they'll say to you that that the numbers did reduce in Australia. During the time of the previous government, which is that period between 2002-3 to about 2008. Well, in that period, there were a number of things that happened internationally. First of all, there was a peace accord in Sri Lanka, and so there wasn't fighting. Secondly, the Taliban were taken out of Afghanistan, and hundreds of thousands of people moved back into Afghanistan as opposed to flowing out. And thirdly, Saddam Hussein was taken out of Iraq, and the same thing happened. So during that period of time, the three major source countries for asylum seekers coming to Australia, there were international events taking place at that time that meant that the flow out had reduced dramatically. Now, what happened after that time was that the peace accord fell apart and war broke out in Sri Lanka. Afghanistan fell apart and more people started moving out, and Iraq became incredibly unstable with hundreds of thousands of people moving out of Iraq, and that started to generate the flows again. And by the time that built up, there was a change of government. They changed policy around Nauru and the Pacific solution and so forth, and now that's all being blamed for why the numbers have increased as opposed to those other factors. The problem is that doesn't make for a good news grab. You can't get that out in a 10-second grab on the TV. It's much more complex than that. So it's very difficult to make those points publicly. But this first part's been all bleak, but it's not all that bad. Because in spite of all the problems, there has been some real progress in the management of asylum seekers. I'm painting you a fairly bleak picture because that's what it's been like in that particular area. Quite apart from the fact that we are, along with Canada, as I said, one of the best in terms of resettlement and integration programs anywhere in the world. there has been real progress in this area, and one of the important messages that I want to give to you today is that that progress has only been achieved by our ability to work in partnership with government. It doesn't matter what you think. At the end of the day, in a democracy like Australia or Canada, the only way to get things done at the big level is by finding ways to engage with government and government officials in those processes. That's how we've managed to get some of the improvements that I'm about to tell you about. And you've got great officials here. Deborah did a great presentation yesterday, but I can tell you as someone who goes to meetings in Geneva frequently that Deborah's at, you get amazingly good representation by your government officials who speak out about the sorts of issues in a constructive and strategic way that helps to advance this sort of stuff. Deb's one, I've met other Canadian officials that do it, Australia has many others. We can tend at times to get into a them and us mentality. Right now, the last thing we need is a them and us mentality, even if it's a conservative government. Now I know, you're all thinking he's drunk, he's got jet lag, but I'm telling you, I lived through a period of conservatism in Australia in my roles that your government hasn't come close to yet. And the reality is this is a very complex issue, and you can't make assumptions about the positions they're taking or why all of the time. You do have to be able to get in there and sit at the pointy end of the table. Activism on its own doesn't necessarily generate change. You have to be able to sit at the table. Things get done, as Jed Bartlett in the West Wing said, by people who turn up. And we need to find ways of turning up to help get things done. Might sound difficult. We had a national conference of all the torture and trauma services in Australia, about 400 people, and it was a terrible shock to them because everyone tends to be more in the left when you're working in this area. It was a terrible shock to them when I said to them one night in a presentation about advocacy, you're probably not going to get much sleep tonight because I have to tell you that most of you owe your jobs to Philip Ruddock and Tony Abbott, who were two of the arch conservatives. Tony Abbott is the current opposition leader. Philip Ruddock was the one who led the TPV charge and all of those sorts of things. But when it came to resettled refugees, they were prepared to invest millions of dollars, in fact hundreds of millions of dollars in it. It's not a straightforward exercise. If you're not at the table, you can't influence it. And my experience is that most government officials want to do things as well as they can possibly be done. They're constrained because they're engaged or employed to implement policy of the day, but by working as closely with them as possible, good things can be achieved. So I want to encourage you to think about that here in Canada as well. We learnt the hard way. We went for years of not engaging. We went for years in trench warfare and we got nowhere. And all it did was terrify the general public. All of us love refugees and asylum seekers. That's what we do. You know, we care about it, we understand the issues, but we represent about 0.1% of the population. And we don't represent the ones that are going to change government or influence government. So we have to think strategically about how we go about dealing with these issues. I know I might be out of time, aren't I? No? Excellent. So perhaps we can have some conversation about that. I want to tell you about some of the good things that are happening. Apart from resettlement, I'm pleased to tell you that over the last 18 months there has been some major shifts in policy to the release from detention facilities of thousands of asylum seekers. Much of it was formulated by the council that I chair, and we were able to work in partnership with other NGOs and our government officials to get it implemented. It's called residence determination, or euphemistically referred to in Australia as community detention. Because while they're allowed to live in the community and supported to live in the community, they're technically, according to the legislation, still in detention. So it means they can't work, for example. But they get housing, they get healthcare, they get education, they get all of those sorts of things. Now, when we started this, when we began advocating for this policy, people said it couldn't work. We couldn't find the housing, we couldn't get it done, people wouldn't cooperate, all of those sorts of things. And the initial target was for 900 people. Since that time, 4,500 have been released over that 18 months into community detention arrangements. The priority was primarily families and unattached minors, and then vulnerable groups, and it continues to be that as a priority. But it's an extremely positive step forward. They call it community detention for language reasons, to sell it to the public or whatever. And I got past caring about it because it essentially means they live like everybody else in the community, but with a lot more support. In fact, one of the problems was that it was calibrated in a way where the level of assistance they were getting was probably a bit too high, because some, when they got their visas, didn't want to move out of it into the resettlement program because the level of services weren't quite as high as that. But it's been an extremely positive thing. And for all of the doomsdays that said it couldn't happen, it would be terrible and so forth, the sky didn't fall in by having those 4,500 asylum seekers released from detention and living in the community. And that's been the best message about it. As I said, that could only happen because of external advocacy, but working strategically and in partnership with government officials as well to get that done. At the moment too, as a result of the Malaysia deal falling over and the fact that you can't have the number of detention centres you need around Australia to detain all of the people coming anyway, there is a process now being in place of people being released onto bridging visas into the community while their applications are being finalised. Now, this is a phenomenal change for us in Australia and something we're desperately trying to bed down. Because again, if we can make that work, in partnership with the department and a very wide range of NGOs, if we can get it bedded down and prove that, again, the sky's not going to fall in by doing this, then perhaps we can get it to be a lasting part of policy ongoingly. It's not as generous as community detention. People get an initial 6 weeks of support with housing and so forth. They're allowed to work. If they require mental health care or other health care, they receive that through our national health scheme. If at the end of that 6 weeks some remain extremely vulnerable, they get additional assistance and they can go and live in the community with that additional assistance as well. But by and large, it's structured so that there's an initial injection of assistance and then they're meant to largely contend for themselves. Now that's going to create challenges because it's not easy to find work at the moment, and so some of them are going to suffer from destitution. And what we're doing again is trying to find ways of working with the government to create programs that would enable that not to be the case, or for them to get some assistance. Is that for me? That's not funny actually. Sometimes it's happened to me in the past. So at the moment, they're releasing about 500 a month from detention to do that. They would increase 800 to 1,000 a month if they could, but actually the sector can't cope with it at the moment. Our ability to find that level of housing that quickly, that's affordable for people is very, very difficult in Australia at present. So some of the impediments to that happening more quickly is to do with our ability to provide the services, and it's a real challenge for us because it's much more preferable for people to be out of detention, much more preferable for them to be out of detention. But it's hard for us to be able to move as quickly as we want to move, and there is some limits on the budget for it as well. The problem is that the government's actually begun doing it through clenched teeth. They couldn't get the Malaysia thing up. It wasn't practical to keep detaining people, so they felt compelled to do it. So for ages I was saying, we'll let them out in those community groups that keep annoying us, can just look after them. But thanks to people in the immigration department who've gradually gone back and nudged them along, we've been getting more assistance to help them out. There is one issue that I want to tell you about in Australia, and I don't know how it works here in Canada, but there's a small group, and it's increasing, of people who are in an incredibly difficult position, and they are people who have been found to be refugees, but who have not been security cleared, where our security agents has given them an adverse security assessment. Now in Australia, there is no review of those assessments. You're not told why you're rejected. You have no information whatsoever about the reasons on which you're being given an adverse security assessment. At present there's 55, but it's increasing all the time. And under current policy and law, it means that you will be in detention for the rest of your life. Been found to be a refugee, but you'll be in detention for the rest of your life. You can't return into the country of origin because we found them to be a refugee. But our security agency has said they're not safe there's a risk for them to be placed into the community. Before I left, there was a High Court challenge that was instituted against that position, and we're expecting the decision to come down in the next few weeks. If the decision goes for the plaintiff, who was a Tamil asylum seeker in detention and has been in detention 3 times, 3 years, been found to be a refugee on 4 occasions, twice by Australia and twice by UNHCR. If it's successful, it will create a huge shift in Australia. It will probably generate, I think, a stronger call for an independent review mechanism of those sorts of decisions, which I know Canada has, and which we're trying to encourage our government to look at the Canadian model for doing it. But it's a terrible thing to think that someone can be found to be a refugee. It's not that every refugee is an angel, but it's a terrible thing to think that someone can be found to be a refugee and be locked up forever without ever being told why that is the case. It's a shocking thing. So hopefully that court case will be successful and we'll get some changes on that front. For the people affected by this, you know, we have clients all of the time that are affected by this stuff. And it's difficult to communicate a message, particularly to politicians, about the impact of what they do. They don't necessarily go about this to be evil or to brutalise a person. That's not what's in their head. And that's what I mean by you need to get in behind it. We had the Minister for Immigration that introduced mandatory detention. You know, he's a friend of mine, but we used to have screaming arguments about it all the time. In fact, I'd raise it and then he would orbit Saturn for half an hour and I'd just sit in my chair until it came back down to earth and then we'd start the conversation again. But I asked him what it was about for him. Now, he said, look, Paris, you think I'm a really powerful man. I'm only the immigration minister and I have 13,000 places, or back then 12,000 places in my refugee quota. And he'd been to refugee camps. And at one of the camps, a woman handed him her baby that was wrapped up in a blanket, and the baby was dead. It had died of malnutrition. She'd been carrying it around wrapped up for days. And he was absolutely shattered by that experience. And he went to another camp and officers were saying about a group of young people, could you please take these? We don't know if we can keep them alive unless they're resettled. Can you take them? And the quota was full for the year. And in his head, he worked out in a very simplistic way, he said, well, bugger this, I'm only the immigration minister, or I've got 12,000 places per annum. I want those places primarily to go to that woman or those kids and to someone who can afford to pay people something. It's not that straightforward. It's not that logical at one level. But you can understand that it's not necessarily motivated by evil all of the time. And the importance of you getting in behind those sorts of things to understand it will always better inform your strategy for going forward and addressing it. They're difficult things. I think, for me, the issues that we're sort of grappling with here are not actually those of international law, domestic law, or even electoral success. It's what the discussion's always about, but at its core, I don't think it's about that. I think they're about the moral issues against which our identity as human beings, mirrored through our treatment of others, is at question. How do we value the life of another person whom we do not know, as well as we value our own, or would want them to value ours were we in a similar circumstance? Perhaps that's the starting point for judging or determining the effectiveness or appropriateness of policies in this area. And finally, I've said this before, but what I believe is that we're actually dealing with questions of courage and of grace. the courage to preserve the values we know to be best for all, now and in the future, and the grace to do so in the full knowledge that this will require us to share something of ourselves and of our country, with nothing in return other than the preservation of those values and the strengthening of their place in future generations. It's the courage to ensure that the price of our liberties, which Jim was talking about, and standards of living, is not the impoverishment and exclusion of people from developing nations, and the grace to accept that if this continues to be the case, ours and future generations will be impoverished also. And I think it's about the courage to look deep within and to reclaim these values because they're best and central to our existence, and the grace to do so without expunging other views simply because they do not accord with our own. For me, these are some of the challenges that confront us at this point in time on this issue of our time. They compel us to think about the values we want enshrined in our world and our children's worlds. They are challenges that test the moral fortitude of our culture and of our nation, of the civic responsibility we have in the world today, and of the contribution we make to its prosperity. I think if we can think about these issues in those terms, as much as in terms of international or domestic law or whatever, we have a better chance of appreciating how they really need to be framed up. Leave it at that.